Sometimes a man's worst day becomes the beginning of his greatest fortune. Sometimes survival and destiny meet in the most unexpected place. When Jebediah Vance stumbled through the Sonoran Desert with cracked lips and fading hope, he had no idea that a strange bulge on an old cactus would change everything. 3 days without water, the prospector was dying. But what he found inside that swollen saguaro wasn't just salvation, it was a secret that had been hidden for 20 years. A secret worth more than most men earn in a lifetime. What could possibly be growing inside a desert cactus that would save a dying man and make him rich beyond his wildest dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jebediah Vance had turned 58 that spring, though the desert had a way of making a man look older than his years. The sun had carved deep lines around his eyes, the kind that come from squinting at distant horizons and studying the earth for signs that most folks would miss. His hands were rough as dried leather, scarred from years of working rock and rope, and his back carried the slight stoop of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping on hard ground. He hadn't always been a prospector. For 30 years, he'd worked honest ranches across the Arizona territory, breaking horses, mending fences, and doing the kind of steady work that put food on a table and kept a roof overhead. He'd been good at it too, reliable, the kind of man a ranch owner could count on when things needed doing right. Sarah had loved that about him. She'd been a rancher's daughter herself, understood the rhythm of that life, the early mornings, the calloused hands, the simple satisfaction of work, well done. They'd married young, built a small cabin near Prescott, and raised their boy Thomas in the shadow of the Bradshaw Mountains. Those had been good years, quiet years, the kind a man looks back on and realizes he'd been happy without quite knowing it at the time. But Sarah had been gone 5 years now. Fever took her quick that winter, and Jebediah had stood beside her grave, wondering what a man was supposed to do with the rest of his life when the person who made it make sense was gone. Thomas, grown by then and working his own ranch near Flagstaff, had wanted his father to come live with them. His wife, Emma, had been kind about it, insistent even, saying they had plenty of room and could use the help. Jebediah had tried it for 6 months, tried to be grateful, tried to fit into the space they'd made for him. But he'd felt like a chair nobody quite knew where to put, always in the way, always aware he was someone's burden, however kindly they bore it. Thomas had his own family now, his own life. A father shouldn't be a weight around his son's neck. So Jebediah had taken what little savings he had, bought himself a good pack mule he'd named Clementine, and set out to do what his grandfather had done before him: prospect, search the wild places for the silver and gold that the Arizona territory still held in its rocky heart. Maybe make something of himself again. Maybe prove he wasn't done being useful just because his hair had gone white. Thomas hadn't understood. They'd argued about it in the barn that last morning, their voices echoing off the rafters, while Emma kept the grandchildren inside. "You're too old for this, Pa," Thomas had said, and there'd been genuine worry in his eyes. "The desert'll kill you. Come spring or come winter makes no difference. A man alone out there. I've been working under this sun since before you were born." Jebediah had replied, strapping his bedroll tight. "I know what I'm doing." Knowing and surviving are two different things. Ma wouldn't want this. That had stung because it was probably true. Sarah would have told him he was being a stubborn old fool. But Sarah wasn't here anymore, and stubbornness was about all Jebediah had left to prove he was still his own man. They hadn't spoken since. That was 3 years ago. Jebediah had sent a few letters care of the Flagstaff post office, but never got replies. He told himself Thomas was busy with ranch work and family. Told himself his son would come around eventually. But in the quiet moments, usually just before sleep, he wondered if he'd traded his last real connection to family for pride and the freedom to fail on his own terms. The prospecting life suited him in some ways. He liked the solitude, the way days could pass without having to make conversation or pretend things were fine when they weren't. He liked the independence of it, answering to nobody but himself and the land. Most of all, he liked that it gave him a purpose beyond being someone's aging father who needed looking after. But 3 years of searching had yielded almost nothing. A few small silver deposits that barely covered his supplies. Some turquoise he'd sold in Tucson for enough to keep going another month. Nothing that would let him walk into Thomas's ranch with his head high and proof that he'd been right to chase this dream. His funds were down to almost nothing now. Another few weeks and he'd have to find work in one of the mining camps, swinging a pickaxe for wages like a common laborer. The thought sat bitter in his chest. That's when he'd heard about the surveyor's map. He'd been in Tucson, sitting in a cantina nursing a whiskey he could barely afford, when he'd overheard 2 miners talking about an old drunk who claimed to have army survey maps from the 1862nd. Maps that showed water sources and mineral deposits the government had documented but never developed. The miners laughed about it, probably just a drunk's fantasy, but Jebediah had listened close. He'd found the surveyor 3 days later, sleeping off a drunk in an alley behind the mercantile. The man was maybe 60, dressed in clothes that had once been respectable, but were now just rags held together by grime. His name was Horace, and he'd indeed worked for the Army Corps of Engineers back during the Apache campaigns. "Got maps," Horace had slurred, tapping his temple. "Up here. And some I saved when they were going to burn 'em." Jebediah had bought him breakfast and listened to his rambling stories about surveying the Sonoran Desert in '63, about water sources they'd marked for cavalry patrols, about places where the rock showed promising color. Most of it was probably nonsense, but there was enough specific detail to make Jebediah wonder. For $5 money he couldn't spare, Horace had sold him a torn fragment of an old survey map. It showed a section of the Sonoran about 30 miles south of Tucson, with a spring marked clearly in faded ink. The paper was brittle and stained, but the cartography looked legitimate, military precision in the way the contours were drawn. "That spring's still good," Horace had said, his rheumy eyes suddenly focused. "Fed by an underground aquifer. Never runs dry. You find that, you got yourself a base camp for working the whole area." Jebediah had studied the map for a week before deciding it was a risk, could be chasing nothing but a drunk's lies, but he'd been chasing nothing for 3 years anyway. At least this gave him direction. The one thing he carried that had real value, beyond Clementine and his tools, was his grandfather's compass. It sat heavy in his vest pocket now, as he made his preparations, a brass compass with a tarnished case, the kind that opened with a satisfying click. Inside the lid, someone had scratched an inscription years ago: "True north ain't always north." His grandfather, Jacob Vance, had been a prospector too, back in the California gold rush days. He'd made a small fortune in the Sierra Nevada, lost most of it in bad investments, then spent his later years wandering Arizona looking for the strike that would set everything right again. He'd died out in the Superstition Mountains when Jebediah was 16, his body found 3 months after he'd gone missing. They'd buried him with his tools and his dreams. But they'd given Jebediah the compass. His grandfather had carried it through 30 years of searching, and now it was his. Jebediah opened it sometimes, just to hear the click, to feel the weight of it. The inscription had puzzled him as a boy, but he understood it now. Sometimes the direction you needed to go wasn't the direction that made logical sense. Sometimes you had to trust your gut, follow the path that felt right, even when everyone else thought you were lost. That compass had become something of a talisman for him. When Thomas had called him foolish for prospecting, when the lonely nights pressed down heavy, when he found nothing but dry holes and false leads, he'd hold that compass and remember that his grandfather had walked this same hard road. Had died doing it, sure, but had died free and still searching. There were worse ways for a man to spend his years. 3 days before setting out into the Sonoran, Jebediah had made camp outside Tucson and gone through his supplies with careful attention. He had 4 canteens, each holding a quart. 2 canvas water bags that held 2 gallons between them. Dried beef, hardtack, coffee and cornmeal. His bedroll, cooking pot and tin cup. The Bowie knife his father had given him, a good blade with a bone handle, worn smooth from use. A small pickaxe and a miner's hammer. Rope. Matches in a sealed tin. The survey map. The compass. And Clementine, of course. She was getting old too, maybe 15 years now, but she was steady and smart. Had more sense than most people Jebediah knew. She'd carried his supplies through 3 years of wandering and never once given up on him, even when the terrain got rough and the water ran short. He'd checked her hooves carefully, made sure she was well fed and rested. The desert didn't forgive mistakes, and a lame mule could mean death out there. The night before he left, he'd sat by his campfire and written a letter to Thomas. Didn't mail it, probably wouldn't mail it, but wrote it anyway. Told his son he was sorry for being stubborn. Told him about the map and the spring, and how maybe this would be the one that paid off. Told him he understood if Thomas didn't want to hear from an old fool who'd chosen rocks and solitude over family. He'd folded that letter and tucked it in his saddlebag, alongside the few others he'd written and never sent. Maybe someday he'd have the courage to mail them. Or maybe Thomas would find them after Jebediah was gone, and at least know his father had been thinking of him, even out here in the empty places. The morning he set out, the sky was clear, and the temperature was already climbing toward 90 by the time the sun cleared the mountains. Jebediah checked his compass, oriented himself with the map, and headed south into country he'd never seen before. He was confident then. He had water for a week if he was careful, and the map showed the spring was only 2 days' travel. He'd reach it, set up a proper camp, and spend a month working the area methodically. Maybe he'd find something, maybe he wouldn't. But at least he'd know he'd tried, and he'd do it on his own terms. The desert stretched out before him, vast and ancient, and indifferent to whether one more old prospector lived or died, crossing it. The saguaro cacti stood like sentinels across the landscape, some of them 40 feet tall and 200 years old. They'd seen countless men pass through, and they'd remain long after Jebediah was dust. He touched the compass in his pocket one more time, felt its reassuring weight, then clicked his tongue to get Clementine moving. Behind him, Tucson disappeared into the heat shimmer. Ahead, the Sonoran waited, beautiful and deadly, and full of secrets that maybe only the desperate and stubborn would ever find. The first day was easy, almost pleasant, if a man could call, walking through country where the temperature hit 105 by noon, pleasant. But Jebediah had walked through worse, and he had water, and he had direction. The map showed a clear path, follow the dry wash southeast for 12 miles, then cut east toward a distinctive rock formation that looked like a broken tooth. The spring would be just beyond that, tucked into a small canyon where the rock held the water cool and clean. He walked steadily, leading Clementine by her rope, stopping every hour to rest in whatever shade they could find. Usually that meant the shadow of a saguaro or a rocky outcrop. The desert wasn't completely barren. There were patches of palo verde trees, their green bark bright against the brown earth, and clusters of barrel cactus that the Mexicans called biznaga. Birds called from hidden perches, and once he saw a roadrunner dart across the sand, chasing a lizard. By evening, he'd covered good ground. His legs ached the way they always did after a full day's walk, but it was an honest ache. He made camp in the lee of a large boulder, built a small fire from dried mesquite branches, and boiled coffee in his tin pot. The hardtack was stale as always, but he had some dried apples he'd been saving, and they tasted sweet after the long day. Clementine munched on the sparse grass that grew near the boulder, and Jebediah checked her over by firelight. Her hooves looked good, no signs of soreness or cracking. She was breathing easy. A good mule, worth more than most of what he owned. He pulled out the compass before sleeping, opened it by the firelight, and read the inscription again. True north, ain't always north. His grandfather's words, or whoever had scratched them into the brass all those years ago. Tomorrow he'd reach the spring. Tomorrow things would start looking up. The second day started well enough. He woke before dawn, made more coffee, and was walking by the time the sun cleared the horizon. The rock formation from the map came into view around mid-morning, a tall spire of reddish stone that did indeed look like a broken tooth against the sky. Jebediah felt a surge of confidence. The surveyor hadn't lied about everything. That formation was right where it should be. He adjusted his course, angling more directly east now, following the map's instructions. The terrain got rougher here, more broken rock and less sand. Clementine picked her way carefully, and Jebediah kept one hand on her lead rope, talking to her softly the way he always did. "Not much further, girl. Water soon. Good, cool water." By noon, they should have reached the canyon, should have heard water, smelled the dampness that came with a desert spring. But there was nothing, just more rock, more heat, more empty sky. Jebediah stopped and pulled out the map, studying it carefully. The distances matched, the rock formation was right, the canyon should be. And then he saw it. Not a canyon, but a depression in the land where a canyon might have once been. The rock showed water stains from long ago, channels carved by flowing water that no longer flowed. He scrambled down into the depression, Clementine following reluctantly. At the lowest point, where the spring should have been, there was only dry stone and a few dead branches from a cottonwood tree that had given up years ago. The spring was gone, dried up. Maybe the aquifer had shifted. Maybe the earth had changed in the 20 years since Horace's map was drawn. Didn't matter why. What mattered was that there was no water here, and Jebediah had been counting on there being water here. He sat down on a rock and did the calculations in his head. He'd drunk nearly a gallon yesterday and this morning, had maybe 6 quarts left between his canteens and water bags. If he turned around right now, started back for Tucson immediately, he'd run out before he made it halfway. The desert didn't care about his miscalculations. The desert would kill him for this mistake. But he didn't turn around. Not right away, because there was a part of him, the stubborn part, the part that had left Thomas's ranch to prove something, that thought maybe there was water nearby. Maybe another spring the map hadn't shown. Maybe, if he pushed just a little further. He pushed further. That afternoon, he rationed the water carefully. 1 small sip every hour, just enough to keep his mouth from completely drying out. He shared a canteen with Clementine, watching her drink with worried eyes. She was carrying all his gear. If she went down, he'd have to leave everything. The land stayed harsh and waterless. He saw no signs of springs, no vegetation that would indicate underground water, just rock and sand and cactus that survived on the rain that fell maybe twice a year. By evening, he knew he'd made a bad choice, should have turned back at noon, should have accepted the loss and headed for Tucson while he still had enough water to make it. But the sun was setting now, and walking in darkness was foolish. He'd camp here, start back at first light, and hope he could make it. That night, he dreamed of Sarah. She was standing by their cabin in Prescott, hanging laundry on the line, and she looked at him with those gentle eyes and said, "You always were stubborn, Jeb, even when it costs you." He woke in darkness, throat already dry, and knew she was right. The third day was when things got bad. He started before dawn, not bothering with coffee or food. Every drop of water was precious now. He had maybe 4 quarts left, and it was at least 30 miles back to Tucson, longer if he got turned around. The map that had promised salvation now felt like a curse folded in his pocket. Clementine stumbled twice before noon. The second time, she went down heavy and didn't want to get up. Jebediah knelt beside her, checking her legs, talking to her softly. "Come on, girl. Come on now. We can make it." But she was exhausted and dehydrated, and when she did struggle to her feet, she could barely walk. By early afternoon, when the sun was a hammer beating down on them both, she collapsed again in the sparse shade of a Palo Verde tree. This time, she wouldn't get up. Jebediah sat beside her, one hand on her neck, feeling her breathing. She was done. He'd pushed too far, trusted a drunk's map too much, and now his mule was dying in the desert because of it. He shared the last of one canteen with her, pouring water into his cupped hand and letting her drink. It wouldn't save her, but it would ease her suffering a little. Then he stood and looked at his supplies, loaded on her back, his bedroll, his tools, the food he had left, all of it too heavy to carry in this heat. He took only what would fit in his pockets and hands: the compass, the Bowie knife his father had given him, the 3 remaining canteens, maybe 2 quarts between them, a handful of hardtack wrapped in cloth, the map, though he wanted to burn it. "I'm sorry, girl," he said, and his voice cracked. "I'm sorry I wasn't smarter." He left her there in the shade and started walking north. His tongue was already swelling, his lips cracking. The sun beat down like it had a personal grudge. Every step felt heavier than the last, and his thoughts started to drift and scatter like tumbleweeds. He saw Sarah again, walking beside him in the shimmering heat. She didn't say anything this time, just looked at him with sad understanding. He saw his grandfather too, young and strong, leading him through these same rocks back when Jebediah was a boy. "True north ain't always north," the old man said, and laughed. The water was gone by late afternoon. He'd tried to ration it, but the heat pulled it out of him faster than he could replace it. His vision started to blur, and he stumbled more often. Once, he fell and lay there for what might have been minutes or hours, watching a vulture circle overhead. He got up because lying down meant dying, and he wasn't quite ready to die yet. Not here, not like this. Not without telling Thomas one more time that he was sorry, that he'd been a stubborn old fool, that pride was a poor trade for family. That's when he saw the cactus. It stood maybe 100 yards away, a big saguaro, taller than most, and halfway up its trunk there was a bulge, not a natural arm growing out at an angle like most saguaros had. This was different, swollen, like the plant had a massive growth pushing out from inside. Jebediah stopped walking, stared at that bulge. His mind was fuzzy from dehydration, but somewhere in the fog he remembered something. Cactuses stored water. That's how they survived. And that swelling, that unnatural bulge, maybe it was full of water. Maybe the plant had hit an underground source and was hoarding it all in that one spot. It was probably nothing. Probably just his dying brain inventing hope where there was none. But he had nothing left to lose except the few minutes it would take to walk over there and check. He stumbled toward the cactus, fell once, got up, kept walking. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon now, painting everything orange and red. Pretty, in a way. The desert was always pretty when it was killing you. He reached the cactus and put one hand against it for support. The flesh was tough and warm from the sun. Up close, the bulge was even more dramatic, easily 3 feet across, like something had grown inside the plant, and the plant had just kept growing around it. With trembling hands, Jebediah pulled out his Bowie knife. The blade was good steel, well cared for, sharp enough to shave with, if a man was careful. He touched the edge to his thumb and felt it bite. This knife had never failed him. His father had given it to him 30 years ago, told him a good blade was worth more than gold because it could keep you alive. Time to find out if that was true. He raised the knife and drove it into the cactus bulge, right where it swelled the largest. The blade went in, met resistance, then clanged against something hard, something metallic. Jebediah stopped, stared at his knife. That wasn't supposed to happen. Cactus flesh was fibrous and wet. It didn't clang. It didn't. He cut again, more carefully this time, slicing the tough skin of the plant, pulling it back in strips, digging deeper. And there, wrapped in 20 years of cactus growth, was the corner of something rusted and metal. A box. There was a box inside the cactus. For a moment, he forgot he was dying. Forgot the thirst and the pain and the burning sun. All he could do was stare at that impossible thing and wonder what in God's name he'd just found. The human mind does strange things when it's close to shutting down. Jebediah stood there with his knife in one hand and pieces of cactus flesh in the other, staring at rusted metal that shouldn't exist, and wondered if he'd finally crossed over into full hallucination. Maybe he was already dead. Maybe this was what came after standing in the desert forever, finding impossible things that made no sense. But the metal was real under his fingers, cold despite the heat, rough with rust and age. He could feel the edges of it where the cactus had grown around it, enveloping it the way a tree might grow around a fence post left standing too long. His father's knife had found it. The same blade his father had carried through the Apache Wars, through 20 years of honest work, through all the moments that made a life. "Take care of this," his father had said when he gave it to Jebediah on his 18th birthday. "A good blade is a man's best friend out here. More reliable than most people, and it'll never let you down if you don't let it rust." Jebediah had kept that knife clean and sharp for 40 years. Now it was showing him something that defied explanation. He started cutting more deliberately, working in a circle around where the metal showed. The cactus flesh was thick and fibrous, wet inside despite the brutal heat. Some of that moisture dripped onto his hands, and without thinking, he licked it off. It tasted bitter and slightly alkaline, but it was wet. His body screamed for more, but he focused on the work. Whatever was in here, it had been hidden a long time. The cactus had to be at least 20 years old based on its size, and this metal box, because that's what it was, he could see it clearly now, had been here for all of it. The saguaro had simply grown around it, absorbed it, turned it into part of itself. He cut for maybe 20 minutes, his arms shaking with exhaustion, until he'd exposed enough of the box to get a sense of its size. It was maybe 2 feet long, a foot wide, and 8 inches deep. A strong box. The kind the army used to use for payroll shipments. He'd seen them before, years ago, when he'd done some work at Fort Whipple. There were words stamped into the metal, but rust and time had made them almost illegible. He could make out U.S. and what might have been 7th Regiment. The rest was lost to corrosion. His hands were bleeding now from the cactus needles and the rough work, but he barely noticed. He wedged the knife blade under one edge of the box and pried. The cactus flesh held it tight, refusing to give up what it had claimed. He pried harder, put his weight into it, and heard the wet sound of plant fiber tearing. The box shifted, moved an inch, then another. Jebediah dropped to his knees and started digging with his hands, pulling away chunks of cactus, ignoring the needles that pierced his palms. The box was coming free now, separating from the plant that had been its home for 2 decades. With one final pull, it came loose entirely, and Jebediah fell backward onto the sand with the strong box in his lap. It was heavy, 20 pounds, maybe 30. The weight of it felt significant in ways that went beyond mere physics. This was something important, something that had been hidden and lost, and was now found again by a dying man who had no business finding it. He set the box on the ground and examined it more carefully. There was a lock, rusted, almost solid, and hinges on the back that looked like they might crumble if he tried to force them open. Stamped on the top, barely visible through the rust, was 1,863, and below that, Fort Bowie. Fort Bowie, the Apache campaigns. His grandfather had talked about those days, about how the army moved payroll through hostile territory in strongboxes, just like this one. About how sometimes those shipments never made it to their destination. The lost payroll of the 7th Regiment, Jebediah heard himself whisper. It was a legend, one of those stories old-timers told in saloons when the whiskey was flowing. A payroll shipment that had disappeared during a skirmish near the Chiricahua Mountains. $20,000 in newly minted gold coins vanished without a trace. The army had searched for months, found nothing, eventually declared it a loss and moved on. But legends had to start somewhere, and this box, stamped with the 7th Regiment designation and dated 1,863, was sitting in his lap in the middle of nowhere. He tried the lock with his knife blade, but the rust wouldn't budge. The box had sealed itself over time, corrosion welding the lock mechanism shut. He'd need to break it open, but his hands were shaking too badly now. The adrenaline that had carried him through the discovery was fading, and the reality of his situation came crashing back. He was still dying, still dehydrated and lost in the desert, with maybe an hour of sunlight left. A box full of gold, if that's what this was, wouldn't help him if he died before he could get it back to civilization. Water. He needed water first. Everything else was secondary. Jebediah looked back at the hole he'd cut in the cactus. The plant was bleeding, its inner moisture running down the trunk in slow rivulets. It was the wrong kind of saguaro to tap for water. Some varieties were drinkable, others would make you sick, but he was well past caring about that. He'd take his chances with poison over certain death by dehydration. He used his cupped hands to catch the moisture dripping from the wound, brought it to his lips, and drank. It tasted awful, bitter, and slightly slimy, but it was liquid. He drank again and again, until his stomach lurched with the sudden input of moisture. He forced himself to stop, to let his body adjust. Too much too fast, and he just vomited all back up. While he waited, he noticed something else. The hole he'd cut in the cactus, where the strongbox had been, it wasn't just oozing the plant's natural moisture. There was clean water pooling at the bottom. Clear, cool water that looked nothing like the bitter cactus juice he'd been drinking. He reached in carefully and scooped some out. Tasted it. It was clean, pure, almost cold. The metal box. It had been acting as a condenser inside the cactus, surrounded by all that moist plant tissue, cooler than the surrounding flesh, because metal conducts heat differently than plant matter. And over the years, moisture had been collecting around it, pooling in the cavity it created, creating a reservoir of clean water right in the middle of the saguaro. The treasure hadn't just been the gold, it had been the water gathered around the gold, the very thing that would keep him alive long enough to spend whatever was inside that rusted box. Jebediah started laughing. It came out cracked and hoarse, but he couldn't stop. He was dying in the desert, and he'd found a treasure that came with its own water supply. His grandfather's inscription echoed in his head, "True north ain't always north." Sometimes salvation came from the strangest directions. Sometimes you found exactly what you needed by not finding what you were looking for. He drank more of the clean water, slowly this time, letting it work its way into his system. His head started to clear, his hands steadied. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and for the first time in 3 days, Jebediah thought he might actually survive this. He picked up the strongbox and tucked it under one arm, gathered the pooled water in his canteens, filling 2 of them from that impossible reservoir inside the cactus. Then he stood, got his bearings from the setting sun, and started walking north toward Tucson. Behind him the saguaro stood wounded but alive, still bleeding slowly from the hole he'd carved in its flesh. It would heal eventually. Cacti were resilient like that. They survived in places nothing else could, held secrets in their flesh, and sometimes saved the lives of stubborn old men who should have known better than to trust a drunk's map. Jebediah walked until the last light faded, then made camp in the shelter of some rocks. He didn't try to open the strongbox yet. That could wait until he was somewhere safe. For now, it was enough to know that he had water, he had shade, and he had whatever fortune or curse was locked inside that rusted metal container. He fell asleep with one hand on the strongbox and the other on his father's knife, and dreamed of nothing at all. Jebediah woke to the sound of ravens calling overhead. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and his body ached in places he'd forgotten could ache. But he was alive, and that was more than he'd expected yesterday afternoon. He sat up slowly, taking stock. His lips were still cracked, his hands were covered in dried blood from the cactus needles, and his throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. But the water in his canteens was real, and the strongbox beside him was real, and those 2 facts changed everything. He drank carefully, just enough to ease the worst of his thirst, then ate a piece of hardtack that took forever to soften in his dry mouth. The desert morning was cool, it would be hot again soon, but for now the temperature was almost pleasant. A good time to walk. Before he set out, though, he had to see what was inside the box that had cost him his mule and nearly his life. Had to know if the legend was real, or if he'd been killing himself over an empty container full of nothing but rust and disappointment. He pulled out his knife and examined the lock again by morning light. It was completely seized with corrosion, the mechanism frozen solid after 20 years inside a cactus. He wasn't getting it open that way. But the hinges on the back looked weaker, the metal more deteriorated. If he could break those, he could pry the whole lid off. He wedged the knife blade under the bottom hinge and applied pressure. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp crack. The hinge broke free, pieces of rusted iron falling onto the sand, one down. He moved to the second hinge, worked it the same way, and felt it give after a moment. The third hinge was stubborn, but eventually it too surrendered to the blade. With all 3 hinges broken, the lid was only held by the rusted lock. Jebediah set the box on a flat rock and drove his knife down hard where the lock met the lid. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, the lock shattered, pieces of corroded metal flying off into the dust. The lid was free. Jebediah's hands were shaking again, but not from dehydration this time. This was anticipation, the kind that comes when you're about to learn whether you're rich or whether you've been chasing ghosts. He gripped the edge of the lid and pulled. It opened with a metallic squeal, rust flaking off as the lid moved for the first time in 2 decades, and inside, gold. The box was filled with gold coins, packed tight and still gleaming despite the years. They caught the morning light and threw it back in warm, buttery reflections. $20 gold pieces, what the newspapers called double eagles. The coins on top were mint perfect, showing no signs of tarnish or wear. Lady Liberty on one side, the eagle on the other, and along the rim, United States of America 1863. Jebediah picked one up with trembling fingers. It was heavy, solid, real. He'd held gold coins before, spent a few in his time, but never one this perfect. Never one that felt like it had just come from the mint yesterday, instead of being buried in a desert cactus for 20 years. He started counting, pulling coins out and stacking them on the rock. 10, 20, 50, 100. The stacks grew, and his hands moved automatically while his mind tried to process what this meant. 200, 300. The box seemed bottomless, each layer revealing another layer beneath it. When he finished counting, there were 473 gold coins sitting on that rock in the early morning sun, $20 pieces. That was $9,460. Jebediah sat back and stared at the fortune in front of him. $9,000, more money than he'd earned in the last 10 years combined, more money than most men saw in a lifetime. Enough to buy a ranch, stock it with cattle, and live comfortably until he died. Enough to walk into Thomas's place and prove he hadn't been a complete fool. Enough to change everything. He picked up another coin and turned it over in his fingers. The gold was warm from the sun now, and he could see every detail of the strike, Lady Liberty's hair flowing in an eternal wind, the eagle's feathers perfectly defined, the date sharp and clear. These coins had been intended to pay soldiers at Fort Bowie in 1863, men fighting and dying in the Apache campaigns, far from home, and they'd never received their wages because some courier or unit had been hit and this payroll had disappeared into the desert. There'd been a fight, probably, an ambush in these same rocks and canyons. Men had died protecting this box, and men had died trying to take it, and in the chaos, it had been lost or hidden, and a saguaro seed had taken root nearby, and over 20 years that cactus had grown and grown until it swallowed the box completely, hiding it better than any human could have planned. The army had written it off. The men who'd hidden it were long dead. This gold had been forgotten by everyone except the storytellers who kept the legend alive in saloons and mining camps. And now it was his. Found by pure chance and desperation, Or was it chance? His grandfather's compass had led him here. In a way, the false map had brought him to exactly the right place to die, which turned out to be exactly the right place to live. True north ain't always north. Sometimes the wrong path was the right path. Sometimes failure led to success. Sometimes dying led to living. Jebediah carefully packed the coins back into the strongbox. They fit perfectly, like they'd been waiting for him to find them and carry them home. He closed the broken lid as best he could and hefted the box. It was heavy, but manageable. He'd carried heavier loads before, and this one was worth the effort. The sun was climbing now, and the temperature was starting to rise. He needed to move, to cover as much ground as possible before the heat became unbearable. Tucson was still 25 miles north, maybe more. 2 days of walking if he paced himself and didn't run out of water again. He slung his canteens over his shoulder, tucked the strongbox under his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world, and started walking. Each step took him further from the cactus that had saved his life, further from Clementine, still lying dead in the desert behind him, and closer to a future he hadn't dared imagine yesterday. His mind wandered as he walked, thinking about what he'd do with the money. First thing would be to send for Thomas. Write him a real letter this time, not one he'd fold up and hide away. Tell him everything about the map, the cactus, the treasure. Ask him to come to Tucson. Maybe they could talk, really talk, without pride getting in the way. He could buy a small ranch near Flagstaff, be close to his son and grandchildren. Could help Thomas expand his operation, be useful in a real way, instead of being someone's burden. Could maybe even rebuild some of what he'd lost when Sarah died. Not the marriage, that was gone forever, but the sense of purpose, of being part of something larger than one man wandering alone in the desert. The gold felt solid and real under his arm. It wasn't just money. It was second chances and new beginnings, and proof that sometimes stubbornness paid off, even when it probably shouldn't have. By midday he'd covered 8 miles. The heat was intense, but he had water and he had motivation. He rested in the shade of an overhanging cliff, drank sparingly, and looked back the way he'd come. Somewhere out there, that Saguaro stood with a hole in its side, still alive, still growing, already healing from the wound he'd carved into it. He'd taken something precious from the desert, but the desert had given it willingly, had kept it safe for 20 years, waiting for the right moment, the right man, the right kind of desperation. He'd come looking for silver and found gold, come looking for water and found fortune, come expecting to die and found a reason to live. True north ain't always north. Indeed. Jebediah stood, adjusted his grip on the strongbox, and continued walking toward Tucson and whatever came next. The second day of walking was harder than the first. The initial euphoria of finding the gold had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of crossing desert terrain while carrying 30 pounds of metal in heat that topped 110. Jebediah's shoulders ached, his feet were blistering inside his boots, and every muscle in his back protested with each step. But he kept walking. The alternative was staying in the desert, and he'd spent enough time with death to know he didn't want to invite it back for another visit. By late afternoon, he spotted what looked like smoke on the northern horizon. Not the smoke from a wildfire, this was the grey-white kind that came from chimneys and cook fires. Civilization. Maybe a ranch, maybe a way station. Either way, it meant people, water, and a place to rest that wasn't a pile of rocks. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains when he reached the source of the smoke, a small trading post built of adobe and weathered wood, standing alone in the desert like a monument to human stubbornness. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Donovan's Station," and there were 2 horses tied out front. The sight of those animals made Jebediah think of Clementine, and the guilt hit him fresh and sharp. He should have turned back sooner, should have saved her instead of pushing on, but regret was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. He needed water, needed food, and needed to not look like a desert madman when he walked through that door. Jebediah set the strongbox down in the shade of the building and checked his reflection in the small window. He looked like Hellface, burned red by the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, 3 days of white stubble on his jaw, and eyes that had seen too much. But his clothes were still mostly intact, and if he wiped the worst of the dust off his face, he might pass for just another prospector having a rough time in the Sonoran. Before going inside, he reached into his vest pocket to check if he still had any money. His fingers touched paper, not currency, but something thinner. He pulled it out carefully and felt his chest tighten. It was a photograph, 4 years old now, taken at a studio in Flagstaff just before he'd left Thomas's ranch for the last time. The image was water-stained from his sweat and the desert moisture, the edges curled and soft, but the faces were still clear enough. Thomas stood tall and serious, his hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma held their youngest daughter, barely 2 at the time. And on the other side stood Jebediah, looking uncomfortable in clothes. Emma had insisted he wear for the photograph a clean shirt, a vest that didn't quite fit, and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. But Thomas's oldest boy, Jacob, named after his great-grandfather, was standing in front of Jebediah, and Jebediah's hand was on the boy's shoulder. The child had been maybe 6 then, and he'd insisted on standing with his grandfather instead of his parents. "You're taller, Grandpa," the boy had said, as if that explained everything. Jebediah stared at that photograph now, at the water stains that made it look like he was crying in the picture even though he hadn't been, and realized he'd been carrying his family with him all along. He'd left them, yes. Walked away because of pride and stubbornness and the fear of being a burden. But he'd kept this photograph close to his heart, literally, through every mile of wandering. The fortune under his arm suddenly felt heavier, not from the weight of the gold, but from the weight of what it represented. He could go back now, could walk into Thomas's ranch with proof that he'd been right to prospect, that the dream wasn't foolish, that he could still provide. But would that fix what was broken between them? Would $9,000 buy back the years of silence and stubborn pride? He tucked the photograph back into his vest pocket, carefully, like it was the most valuable thing he owned. Which, in some ways, it was. Gold could be spent, or lost, or stolen. But that image of his family, the only one he had, was irreplaceable. Inside Donovan's station, the air was cooler and smelled of tobacco smoke and fried meat. 2 men sat at a rough table playing cards, and behind a makeshift bar stood a heavy-set man with a grey beard, Donovan, presumably. The man looked up as Jebediah entered, his eyes taking in the burned face, the dusty clothes. The way Jebediah moved, like every step, hurt. "Water," Jebediah said, his voice coming out hoarse, "and whatever food you've got." Donovan nodded and poured water from a clay jug into a tin cup. Jebediah drank the whole cup in 3 swallows, felt it cool his throat, and held it out for more. "Could say that. Prospecting?" Donovan refilled the cup. "Something like that. Find anything worth the trouble?" Jebediah met the man's eyes and saw genuine curiosity there, not greed. Still, he wasn't about to announce he was carrying a fortune in gold coins. "Enough to get by. You got beans, bread?" "Got both. 2 bits. Jebediah fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a quarter, one of his last coins. He set it on the bar and Donovan took it, then disappeared through a back door. The 2 card players glanced at Jebediah, assessed him as no threat and nothing interesting, and went back to their game. When Donovan returned with a plate of beans and a chunk of cornbread, Jebediah ate like a man who'd forgotten what food tasted like. The beans were oversalted and the bread was stale, but it was the best meal he'd had in days. He washed it down with more water and gradually felt his strength returning. "You got a mule or horse to sell?" Jebediah asked between bites. "Mine didn't make it." Donovan shook his head. "Not at the moment. But there's a ranch about 8 miles north, Murphy's place. He usually has animals to trade. You headed to Tucson?" "That's the plan. It's another hard day's walk from Murphy's. You sure you're up for it?" Jebediah thought about the strongbox waiting outside. about the gold coins inside it, about the photograph in his vest pocket. "I'll make it," he said. "I've come too far not to." After eating, he bought 2 canteens worth of water, paid extra for the privilege, and stepped back out into the late afternoon heat. The strongbox was where he'd left it, untouched. He picked it up, felt the familiar weight settle under his arm, and started walking north again. The photograph pressed against his chest with each step, a reminder of what waited for him beyond the desert. He'd found treasure in the most unlikely place, survived when he should have died, and now he had a choice to make. He could use this gold to prove he'd been right, to validate all the years of wandering and searching. Or he could use it to build bridges, to admit he'd been wrong about some things and right about others, to become the kind of grandfather young Jacob deserved. True north ain't always north. Maybe the real treasure wasn't the gold. Maybe it was having enough to finally go home and mean it, to look Thomas in the eye and say he was sorry, and have the means to prove he wanted to make things right. The sun was setting when he reached Murphy's ranch, a modest spread with a barn, a small house, and a corral holding 6 horses and a few mules. Murphy himself was an old Irishman with a white beard and suspicious eyes, but his expression softened when Jebediah showed him real silver, not promises, and explained he needed an animal to get to Tucson. "Lost your mule in the Sonoran?" Murphy asked, leading him to the corral. "Left her dying under a palo verde tree," Jebediah said quietly. "One of my worst days." Murphy nodded with understanding. "The desert takes what it takes. All we can do is learn from it and try not to make the same mistake twice." They settled on a sturdy mule younger than Clementine had been, with good legs and a calm disposition. Murphy threw in a saddle and some rope for an extra $1, and by the time the last light faded, Jebediah was mounted and heading north with his fortune secure in a saddlebag. He made camp that night near a dry wash, built a small fire, and pulled out the photograph one more time. In the flickering light, the water stains looked less like tears and more like the natural weathering of something carried too long in hard places. His family stared back at him from 4 years ago, frozen in that moment of uncomfortable formality. But Jacob's smile was real, and that had to count for something. Tomorrow he'd reach Tucson. Tomorrow he'd find a telegraph office and send word to Thomas. Tomorrow the real work would begin, the work of rebuilding what pride and stubbornness had broken. But tonight he was alive, and he had gold, and he had hope. Sometimes that was enough. Tucson looked different when you arrived carrying a fortune. The same dust, the same adobe buildings baking in the sun, the same narrow streets crowded with wagons and horses. But now Jebediah saw it through the eyes of a man who had options instead of desperation. The weight of the strongbox in his saddlebag was more than physical. It was possibility. He rode straight to the Wells Fargo office, the one institution in town he trusted to handle valuable cargo. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up as Jebediah entered and immediately assessed him another dusty prospector. Probably broke, probably trouble. "Help you?" the clerk said, not particularly welcoming. Jebediah lifted the strongbox onto the counter with a heavy thunk that made the clerk's eyes widen. "Need to open an account, deposit box. And I'll need a room at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. Bath and meals, for a week at least." The clerk's demeanor changed instantly. Money had that effect. "Of course, sir. Let me get the manager." Within an hour, Jebediah had deposited 450 of the gold coins in the Wells Fargo vault, kept 23 for immediate expenses, and signed papers that made him feel more legitimate than he'd felt in years. The manager himself had handled the transaction, counting each coin carefully and writing Jebediah a receipt that stated his deposit total, $9,000. "Quite a strike you made, Mr. Vance," the manager said, shaking his hand. "Congratulations." Jebediah accepted the congratulations with a nod, not mentioning that luck and desperation had more to do with it than skill. Let them think he was a successful prospector. Let them treat him like a man who'd earned his fortune instead of one who'd stumbled across it while dying. From Wells Fargo, he went to the Cosmopolitan Hotel, Tucson's finest, which wasn't saying much, but was better than sleeping on rocks. He paid for a week in advance, arranged for his new mule to be stabled, and asked for a bath to be drawn. The clerk, seeing gold coins instead of script, was all efficiency and politeness. In his room, Jebediah stripped off his filthy clothes and sank into the copper tub full of hot water. The heat stung his sunburned skin and the cuts from the cactus needles, but it was the kind of pain that felt like healing. He scrubbed away 4 days of desert grime, watching the water turn brown, and tried to process what had happened. 3 days ago he'd been dying. Now he was rich. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that it felt unreal, like maybe he'd died out there after all. And this was some elaborate dream his brain had conjured in its final moments. But the ache in his muscles was real, and the receipt from Wells Fargo in his vest pocket was real, and the photograph of his family also in his vest pocket, somehow still intact, was real. This was his life now, changed irrevocably by one desperate swing of a knife into a swollen cactus. After the bath, he dressed in clean clothes purchased from the hotel's haberdashery, nothing fancy, just a proper shirt and trousers that didn't have holes in them, and looked at himself in the room's small mirror. Still looked old, still looked weathered, but at least he looked human again, presentable enough to walk into a telegraph office. The Western Union office was 2 blocks from the hotel, a small room that smelled of paper and machine oil. The telegraph operator was a young man, maybe 25, with quick hands and an efficient manner. "Need to send a telegram," Jebediah said, pulling out a piece of paper where he'd written his message. He'd drafted it 3 times in his hotel room, crossing out words, adding others, trying to find the right tone. Too apologetic made him sound weak. Too confident made him sound like he was gloating. He'd settled on something simple and honest, which was harder to write than he'd expected. The operator read the message, counted the words, and quoted a price. Jebediah paid and watched as the young man's fingers flew across the telegraph key, translating his carefully chosen words into electronic pulses that would travel along copper wires to Flagstaff and be delivered to Thomas's ranch. The message itself was brief. "Thomas Vance, Flagstaff, Arizona. Stop found something important. Stop in Tucson for week. Stop would like to talk if you willing. Stop your father. Stop." 20 words. $20 to send them. Each word carefully weighed, because he was paying by the word, but also because these might be the most important words he'd ever sent his son. Found something important, covered both the gold and whatever conclusions he'd come to while dying in the desert. Would like to talk if you willing gave Thomas the choice, acknowledged that 3 years of silence couldn't be erased by one telegram. Your father, instead of just Pa, or his name, felt right, a reminder of the relationship, even if it was strained. "How long until it's delivered?" Jebediah asked. "Message will reach Flagstaff in an hour. Delivery to his ranch depends on when someone makes the ride out. Could be today, could be tomorrow morning." Jebediah nodded. Nothing to do now but wait. Thomas might respond immediately, might take days, might not respond at all. That was the risk of reaching out. The other person could always choose not to reach back. He spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. Got a proper meal at the hotel restaurant, steak and potatoes and vegetables that weren't dried or salted to death. Read a 2-week-old newspaper in the hotel lobby. Watch Tucson's evening life from his window, merchants closing up shop, cowboys heading to saloons, families walking to church services. Normal life, the kind he'd been apart from for 3 years. That night, he pulled out the photograph again and studied it in the lamplight. Thomas's serious face, Emma's quiet smile, the children who'd grown 3 years older since this picture was taken. Jacob would be 9 now, old enough to remember his grandfather, or old enough to have forgotten him. Jebediah didn't know which would be worse. He set the photograph on the bedside table where he could see it, then lay down on the first real bed he'd slept in for months. The mattress felt almost too soft after so many nights on hard ground. But exhaustion won over discomfort, and he drifted off thinking about telegraph wires stretching across the territory, carrying his words north to a son who might or might not want to hear them. The next morning, he woke to knocking on his door. The hotel clerk stood outside with an envelope. "Telegram for you, Mr. Vance. Just came in." Jebediah's hands were shaking as he opened it. The message was shorter than his had been, just 8 words. But they were the 8 words he'd needed to hear. "Arriving Tucson Friday. Stop. Will find you. Stop, Thomas." Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to figure out what he wanted to say, beyond the basics of, "I found gold and I'm sorry." 3 days to decide how honest he wanted to be, about why he'd left, about how lonely he'd been, about how many times he'd almost sent those letters he'd written and hidden in his saddlebag. 3 days to prepare for the most important conversation of his life. Jebediah sat on the edge of his bed, holding that telegram like it was made of gold itself, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. More like the possibility of hope. The sense that maybe he hadn't completely broken what mattered most. Maybe there was a path back to being part of a family, even for a stubborn old man who'd spent 3 years proving he could survive alone. He folded the telegram carefully and put it in his vest pocket, right next to the photograph. 2 pieces of paper, both fragile, both precious. One showing where he'd been, the other suggesting where he might go. Outside his window, Tucson was waking up, merchants opening shops, wagons rolling down dusty streets, the day beginning like any other day. But for Jebediah, nothing felt ordinary anymore. His son was coming. They were going to talk. And whatever happened after that, at least they'd be in the same room, looking each other in the eye, trying. Sometimes that was all a man could ask for. A chance to try again, a second shot at getting it right. He touched his grandfather's compass through his vest pocket, felt its familiar weight, and thought about that inscription one more time. True north ain't always north. He'd taken the wrong path 3 years ago, but maybe that wrong path had led him to exactly where he needed to be to find the right path home. 3 days until Thomas arrived. 3 days to get ready. 3 days to figure out how to say everything that needed saying. Jebediah stood, pocketed the telegram, and went downstairs to get breakfast. He had work to do. Thomas arrived a day early. Jebediah was sitting in the hotel lobby reading a newspaper when his son walked through the door. For a moment, neither of them moved, just stood there, taking measure of each other across 3 years of silence. Thomas looked older, thinner. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his clothes, while clean, showed signs of hard wear and careful mending. "Pa," Thomas said finally, his voice careful and neutral. "Son." Jebediah stood slowly, acutely aware of the new clothes he was wearing, the clean-shaven face, the fact that he looked more prosperous than he had any right to look. "Didn't expect you until tomorrow. Got an early start. Emma's cousin could watch the ranch for a few days." Thomas glanced around the hotel lobby, the polished wood, the carpeted floor, the general air of respectability. "Telegram said you found something important." "I did. You want to talk here?" Or, "Somewhere private would be better." They went up to Jebediah's room. Thomas stood near the window, not sitting, his hat in his hands like he might need to leave at any moment. Jebediah recognized the posture. It was the same way he'd stood in Thomas's barn 3 years ago, ready to bolt if the conversation got too uncomfortable. "You look good." "Pa," Thomas said, though there was something careful in his tone. "Prospecting's been kind to you, I guess." "Had a fortunate week," Jebediah said. He pulled out the Wells Fargo receipt and handed it to Thomas. "Found something in the desert. Something that's been lost a long time." Thomas read the receipt, and Jebediah watched his son's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and something else, something that looked almost like pain. $9,000. You found $9,000 in gold. The lost payroll of the 7th Regiment. I know it sounds like a tall tale, but I believe you. Thomas handed the receipt back, his hand shaking slightly. "I believe you because the universe has that kind of humor. 3 years I begged you not to go out there. 3 years I worried you'd die alone in some canyon. And you find this." There was an edge to his voice that Jebediah couldn't quite read. Not anger, exactly. Something more complicated. "I nearly did die," Jebediah said quietly. "Lost my mule. Was down to my last hours when I found the cactus that had grown around the strongbox. The gold saved me, but the water that had condensed around it, that's what kept me alive long enough to carry it out." Thomas absorbed this, nodded once. "I'm glad you made it." "I am." He paused, seemed to be wrestling with something. "Can I sit down?" "Of course." Thomas sat heavily in the room's single chair, and Jebediah perched on the edge of the bed. They were maybe 6 feet apart, but it felt like miles. The silence stretched between them, and Jebediah realized he didn't know how to bridge it. All the speeches he'd practiced, all the carefully chosen words, they'd all fled in the face of actually sitting across from his son. "I wrote you letters," Jebediah said finally. "Never sent them, but I wrote them, every few months, telling you about where I was, what I'd found, asking how you were." "I never got any letters," Thomas said, "but I wrote a few too. Also never sent them." That admission hung in the air between them, two stubborn men, each waiting for the other to break first. It would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. "I'm sorry," Jebediah said, "for leaving the way I did, for choosing pride over family, for all of it." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, and Jebediah saw his grandfather in his son's face, the same set to the jaw, the same way of measuring a man's words against his actions. "I'm sorry too," Thomas said finally, "for making you feel like a burden, for not understanding why you needed to go." The apologies settled between them, not fixing everything but starting to build something. A foundation, maybe. A place to stand while they figured out the rest. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. His hand hesitated before handing it over, like he wasn't sure he should. "There's something you should know. Something I need to tell you about why I came." Jebediah took the paper and unfolded it. It was a notice from the First Territorial Bank of Flagstaff, official-looking with stamps and signatures. He read it once, then read it again to make sure he understood. It was a foreclosure notice. The bank was calling in Thomas's loan, the one he'd taken out 5 years ago to expand his ranch, buy more cattle, build a new barn. He'd been making payments, the letter said, but they'd been irregular and insufficient. The bank was demanding full payment of the outstanding balance, $3,200 within 60 days, or they'd seize the ranch. "When did you get this?" Jebediah asked, his voice tight. 2 weeks ago. Same day your telegram arrived, actually." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I thought that was funny at first. The timing." "What happened? You were doing well." "The ranch was... Drought hit us hard last year. Lost half the herd. Then Emma got sick, something with her lungs, and the doctor bills were more than I'd saved. I've been scraping by, trying to catch up." But Thomas gestured at the notice. "They want their money, all of it." Jebediah felt the room tilt slightly. His son hadn't come because of the telegram, or not just because of it. He'd come because he was desperate, because he needed help, and pride be damned when your family's home was on the line. "So, when you got my telegram," Jebediah said slowly, "saying I'd found something important, I hoped," Thomas said simply, "I hoped it was money, hoped maybe for once the universe would line things up right, and I hated myself for hoping that. For coming here not just to see you, but because I need—" He stopped, looked away. "I'm sorry. This isn't how I wanted this to go." Jebediah looked at the foreclosure notice, at the sum demanded, at the date the payment was due. Then he looked at his son, his proud, honest son, who'd swallowed that pride to come ask for help, even though it clearly tore him up to do it. $3,000, Jebediah said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you I have it. More than enough." Jebediah set the notice on the bed between them. "I can write you a bank draft tomorrow morning. Pay off the whole loan with interest. Your ranch is saved." Thomas's eyes filled with something that might have been relief or might have been tears. "Pa, I can't just take your money. You earned that. You nearly died for it. You're my son. Your children are my grandchildren. This gold's been sitting in the desert for 20 years, waiting for someone to need it. Turns out that someone is us." Jebediah leaned forward. "But I need to know something. If I'd telegraphed saying I'd found nothing, would you have come anyway?" The question hung there, honest and necessary. Thomas met his father's eyes and said, "Yes, I would have come. Maybe not right away. Maybe I would have waited a while longer, let the pride work itself out. But I would have come eventually. I've wanted to for 3 years. The money it gave me an excuse to move faster." "That's all I needed to know," Jebediah said. He stood, opened his wardrobe, and pulled out the strongbox he'd kept it in his room, not trusting the hotel safe. "Come here. I want to show you what saved my life." Thomas stood and walked over as Jebediah opened the broken lid. Inside were the 23 gold coins he'd kept out of the vault, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight coming through the window. $20 gold pieces, Union Army payroll from 1,863. 473 of them hidden inside a saguaro cactus for 2 decades. Jebediah picked one up and handed it to Thomas. "This isn't just money, son. It's second chances, for both of us." Thomas turned the coin over in his fingers, studying Lady Liberty's profile, the eagle on the reverse. "How did it end up in a cactus?" "Some soldier or courier probably buried it during an Apache raid. Meant to come back for it. Never did. A seed took root near the cache, and over 20 years that cactus grew right around the strongbox. Hid it better than any man could have planned." Jebediah took the coin back, set it with the others. "I was dying when I found it. No water left, no hope left. Cut into that cactus thinking I'd find moisture, found this instead. And the moisture that had condensed around the metal, that's what saved me. The treasure and the water together. Like it was meant to be found by someone desperate enough to cut open a cactus," Thomas said softly. "True north ain't always north," Jebediah said, pulling out his grandfather's compass and opening it to show Thomas the inscription. "Grandpa Jacob's words. I thought I understood them, but I didn't. Not really. Not until I found this gold by looking for water in the wrong place." Thomas read the inscription, and something in his face softened. "I remember him, barely. He used to let me play with that compass. It's yours now if you want it. You and your family. You're the true north. I should have been following all along." They stood there in the afternoon light, father and son, with a fortune in gold between them and 3 years of silence behind them. Not everything was fixed. There were still hard conversations to have, still trust to rebuild, but they were trying. That had to count for something. "Tomorrow," Jebediah said, "we'll go to the bank together. Pay off your loan. Then maybe you could stay a few days, and we could talk, really talk, about everything." Thomas nodded. "I'd like that, Pa. I'd like that a lot." Outside the window, Tucson's afternoon business continued, wagons rolling, people walking, life carrying on the way it always did. But in this small hotel room, something had shifted. The path forward wasn't completely clear yet, but at least they were walking it together, and sometimes that was the best a man could hope for. Not perfection, but presence. Not everything solved, but everything possible. The next morning, they walked together to the First Territorial Bank of Tucson. Jebediah had withdrawn $4,000 from his Wells Fargo account, more than Thomas needed, but he wanted his son to have a cushion, something to rebuild with. The weight of that many gold coins required a small leather satchel, and Jebediah carried it with both hands, acutely aware that this was more money than most men saw in 5 lifetimes. Thomas walked beside him, quiet but present. They hadn't talked much over breakfast, but it was a comfortable silence now instead of the strained kind. Progress, Jebediah thought. Not perfect, but better. The bank was busy. Territorial banks always were on Friday mornings, but the manager, a man named Whitmore, who knew Thomas from his dealings in Flagstaff, saw them immediately when Jebediah mentioned they were there to pay off a loan. "Mr. Vance," Whitmore said, shaking Thomas's hand. Then, more carefully, "And this must be your father." "Jebediah Vance," Jebediah said, setting the satchel on Whitmore's desk with a solid thunk. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "I understand you're here about the foreclosure notice on the Vance ranch." "I'm here to pay it off in full," Thomas said. "The entire outstanding balance, plus any accrued interest." Whitmore opened a ledger, ran his finger down a column of numbers. "The total is $3,247. With interest through today, that comes to $3,312. Jebediah opened the satchel and began counting out gold coins in stacks of 10. Whitmore watched with growing astonishment as the stacks multiplied across his desk. 10, 20, 30 stacks. 166 $20 gold pieces, gleaming in the morning light, streaming through the bank's windows. "That's $3,320, Jebediah said. "Keep the extra for any fees or processing." Whitmore called for a clerk to verify the count, and for 20 minutes the office was filled with the soft clink of gold coins being tallied and recorded. When it was done, Whitmore wrote up a receipt, stamped it with the bank's seal, and handed it to Thomas, along with another document, the deed to the ranch, marked "Paid in full" in bold letters across the bottom. Thomas held that deed like it was the most precious thing in the world, and Jebediah supposed it was. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was Thomas's home, his children's future, his wife's security. It was everything they'd built together, saved from being auctioned off to pay debts. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice thick. Outside the bank, they stood on the boardwalk and let the reality of what had just happened sink in. Thomas looked at the deed again, then at his father. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "Don't need thanks," Jebediah said. "Need you to keep that ranch running, keep raising those kids right. That's all the thanks I require. Still, this is—" Thomas struggled for words. "This changes everything." "It does," Jebediah agreed. "But not in the way you might think." They spent that day together in Tucson, not talking about heavy things but just being. Jebediah took Thomas to a proper restaurant for lunch, the kind with tablecloths and multiple forks, and they ate steak and talked about cattle prices and weather patterns and all the safe topics that fathers and sons discuss when they're learning how to talk again. In the afternoon, they walked through Tucson's mercantile district, and Jebediah insisted on buying supplies for Thomas to take back good rope, new tools, a bolt of fabric for Emma, toys for the grandchildren. Thomas protested at first, but gave up when he realized his father's stubbornness was as strong as ever, just redirected toward generosity instead of isolation. That evening, they sat in the hotel lobby with coffee and cigars, good ones, the kind Jebediah couldn't have afforded a week ago, and finally started talking about what mattered. "Tell me about the grandchildren," Jebediah said. "The photograph I have is 4 years old. They must have changed." Thomas's face lit up in a way Jebediah hadn't seen since he was a boy himself. "Jacob's 9 now, smart as a whip. Reads everything he can get his hands on, wants to be a doctor someday. Named after your grandfather. That means something," Emma insisted. She said Jacob deserved to have his name carried on, even if he didn't live to see it. Thomas smiled. "The boy asks about you sometimes. Remembers you took him fishing once, before you left." Jebediah remembered. A creek near Thomas's ranch, Jacob, barely 6 years old, laughing every time he caught a tiny sunfish, Jebediah said quietly. "Should have been there for all of them. You're here now. That's what matters." Thomas took a draw on his cigar. "Sarah, she's 5 now. Fierce little thing. Reminds me of her grandmother." The mention of Sarah, his wife, his son's mother, made Jebediah's chest tight. "She'd be proud of them. Of you. The family you've built. She'd be proud of you too, Pa, for finding your way back." They talked late into the evening, filling in the gaps of 3 years. Thomas told him about the drought, about Emma's illness and slow recovery, about the struggles of keeping a ranch running when everything seemed to go wrong at once. Jebediah told him about the prospecting, about the lonely camps and the occasional small finds that kept him going, about the night he'd written all those letters he never sent. "Bring them with you," Thomas said. "The letters. When you come to the ranch, I want to read them." "You want me to come back?" Jebediah tried to keep the hope out of his voice and failed. "Emma will skin me alive if I come home without you. She's been after me for 2 years to swallow my pride and reach out. Said life's too short for men to be stubborn." Thomas met his father's eyes. "She was right. So yes, I want you to come back. Stay as long as you want. The bunkhouse is empty. You could have your own space. Help with the ranch if you want, or just be there. Be part of the family again." Jebediah felt something break loose in his chest, some knot of fear and loneliness that had been tied there for 3 years. I'd like that very much." They made plans, then practical plans that made it real. Thomas would stay in Tucson 2 more days, helping Jebediah settle his affairs. Then they'd travel north together, taking it slow with stops in decent towns instead of camping in the desert. Jebediah would buy a wagon, load it with supplies and gifts, and arrive at Thomas's ranch like a prosperous grandfather instead of a desperate old man. "We should get you a new mule too," Thomas said. "Can't have you showing up without one. What was her name? The one you lost?" "Clementine." The guilt surged back, sharp and painful. "I should have turned back sooner, should have saved her." "Maybe," Thomas said carefully, "but maybe if you'd turned back you wouldn't have found the cactus, wouldn't have found the gold, wouldn't be sitting here with me right now." He paused. "I'm not saying her death was worth it, but I am saying that sometimes hard things have to happen for good things to follow. That's just how life works." It was wisdom Jebediah hadn't expected from his son, but he recognized the truth in it. Clementine's death was a tragedy he'd carry, but denying everything that came after wouldn't honor her memory. Living well, making good use of the fortune she'd died helping him reach, that was how he could make it mean something. The next morning, they went to the livery together, and Jebediah bought a good mule, younger and stronger than Clementine, with a steady temperament. He named her Sarah, after his wife, after Thomas's daughter, after the women who'd kept hope alive when men were too stubborn to know better. They spent the day outfitting a wagon, a solid one with good wheels and a canvas cover. Jebediah filled it with supplies: tools for the ranch, books for Jacob, dolls for young Sarah, fabric and sewing supplies for Emma, smoked hams and preserved fruits that would last the journey. He bought a new rifle, a Winchester repeater, and ammunition, bought leather goods and rope and all the practical things a rancher needed. Thomas kept protesting it was too much, but Jebediah waved him off. He had $5,000 still sitting in Wells Fargo, more money than he'd ever need for himself. Let him spend it on family. Let him buy back some of the years he'd missed with gifts and generosity. On their final evening in Tucson, they climbed to the roof of the hotel. There was a small observation deck where guests could watch the sunset. They stood side by side, looking out over the desert that had nearly killed Jebediah and then saved him. "I keep thinking about that cactus," Thomas said. "Growing for 20 years around that strongbox, keeping it safe, not knowing what it was protecting, just doing what cacti do, growing, surviving, adapting. Nature's patient," Jebediah said, "more patient than people. That cactus didn't care about the gold, just grew around it because that's what was there. But it saved you anyway. The water that condensed around the metal saved us both, really. If I hadn't found it, I'd be dead, and you'd be losing the ranch." Jebediah pulled out his grandfather's compass, opened it one more time. "True north ain't always north. Took me 3 years, and nearly dying to understand what that meant." "What does it mean?" "Means sometimes you have to get lost to find your way home. Means the direction that makes sense isn't always the right direction. Means I had to go out into the desert to understand what I was walking away from." He closed the compass, held it out to Thomas. "This belongs in the family, with someone who has kids to pass it on to." Thomas took it carefully, understanding the weight of the gift. "I'll give it to Jacob when he's old enough. Tell him his great-great-grandfather carried it through the California gold rush. His great-grandfather carried it through Arizona. His grandfather carried it home. They watched the sun drop behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded Jebediah of the coins that had changed his life. Tomorrow, they'd start north. Tomorrow he'd begin the journey home, this time with purpose instead of pride, with family instead of solitude. The desert spread out below them, vast and beautiful and deadly and forgiving all at once. It had tested him, broken him, and ultimately saved him. He'd come looking for silver and found gold, come expecting to die and found a reason to live, come searching for treasure and found family instead. Sometimes that was how life worked. You aimed for one thing and hit another, and it turned out the thing you hit was what you'd needed all along. True north wasn't always north, but if you kept walking, kept trying, kept your heart open to possibility, eventually you found your way. They left Tucson at dawn, the wagon loaded heavy with supplies and pulled by Sarah the mule, while Thomas rode his horse alongside. The journey to Flagstaff would take 5 days at a comfortable pace, and for the first time in 3 years, Jebediah felt like he was traveling toward something instead of away from it. The first 2 days passed in easy companionship. They talked when the mood struck them and rode in silence when it didn't. They made camp in decent spots with water and shade, cooked proper meals instead of just hardtack and jerky, and slept without the weight of estrangement pressing down on them. It felt like healing, slow and incomplete but real. On the 3rd day, as they crossed into higher country where pine trees replaced desert scrub, Thomas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an envelope. He held it for a moment, seeming to debate something with himself, then handed it to Jebediah. "Emma wrote this 2 years ago," Thomas said. "Asked me to send it to you, care of general delivery in Tucson, since that's where you checked for mail. I didn't send it. Told her it wasn't the right time, that you needed to figure things out on your own." He paused. "I was wrong. She was right. Story of our marriage, honestly." Jebediah took the envelope with careful hands. His name was written on the front in a woman's neat script, and there was a date in the corner, March 1881, 2 years ago, when he'd been camped near Phoenix, finding nothing but disappointment and loneliness. "Why are you giving it to me now?" Jebediah asked. "Because you should know what she wanted to say, what I should have let her say." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "And because when we get home, she's going to ask me if I gave it to you, and I don't want to lie to her." Jebediah opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 2 pages of letter paper, covered in that same neat handwriting. He began to read, "Dear Jebediah, I hope this letter finds you well and safe, wherever you are." I'm writing without Thomas knowing. He'd say I'm meddling, and he'd probably be right. But I've never been good at staying out of family matters when I think someone's making a mistake out of pride. Both of you are making a mistake out of pride. Thomas misses you terribly, though he'd never admit it. He keeps your room exactly as you left it, says it's because he hasn't gotten around to clearing it out, but I know better. He talks about you more than he realizes, remembers stories from when he was young, wonders aloud what you'd think about some decision he's making with the ranch. He's carrying your absence like a weight, Jebediah, and I'm watching my husband hurt himself rather than admit he needs his father. You taught him to be strong and independent, and you did too good a job. Now he thinks asking for help is weakness, thinks needing people is failure. I love him for 1,000 reasons, but his stubbornness isn't one of them, and I'm sorry to say he learned that particular trait from you. The children ask about you, Jacob especially. He remembers fishing with you, remembers the stories you told him about prospecting and the old days. He keeps the picture we took, you know, the one on his bedside table. Sometimes I catch him looking at it before he goes to sleep. He's too young to understand adult pride, and I'm grateful for that. Children know that family matters more than being right. I know why you left. I do. I understand not wanting to be a burden, not wanting to feel like someone's obligation instead of someone's choice. But you were never a burden to us, Jebediah. You were family. You are family. And family has a place at the table not because they earn it, but because they belong there. Thomas won't write this letter. His pride won't let him. So I'm writing it instead, and if you're reading this, it means I managed to convince him to send it. Or maybe I just sent it anyway without telling him. I haven't decided yet. Come home, not because we need you, though we do. Not because you have anything to prove, though I think you've proven it to yourself by now. Come home because you belong here. Come home because life's too short, and the years are too quick, and we're all getting older. Come home because Jacob asks about his grandpa and Sarah doesn't even remember you, and that's not right. Come home because the door's open and always has been. With love and hope, Emma. P.S. Thomas is reading over my shoulder and trying to take this letter away. I'm telling you this so you know he cares, even though he's too proud to say it. Also, he's blushing, which is adorable. Jebediah finished reading and had to wipe his eyes. The letter shook in his hands from the wagon's movement, he told himself, though he knew better. He read it again, slower this time, absorbing every word Emma had written with such care and honesty. She wanted to send this 2 years ago? He finally asked. Thomas nodded, not looking at him. I said no. Told her you'd come back when you were ready. That pushing would just make you dig in deeper, she argued. We fought about it more than once. She was right, and I was wrong. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. Thomas's voice was soft. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, and she spent half our marriage trying to fix the things I'm too stubborn to fix myself, including us. Jebediah folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Does she know I'm coming? Sent her a telegram from Tucson. Just said I found you and we were coming home together. Didn't give details. Figured you'd want to tell the story yourself. What did she say? Thomas smiled. Said, finally. Took you long enough. Then she told me to bring you home safe or don't come home at all. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking, the pine trees whispering in the breeze that was cooler this high up. Jebediah held Emma's letter like it was precious, because it was. It was proof that someone had wanted him home when he'd convinced himself nobody did. It was evidence that family was more patient than pride, more enduring than stubbornness. Thank you, Jebediah said eventually, for giving me this, for coming to Tucson, for letting me come home. Thank you for the gold, Thomas said, for saving the ranch, for, he stopped, started again, for being my father, even when I made it hard. The mountains rose ahead of them, green and solid and permanent. Somewhere up there was Thomas's ranch, Emma waiting, grandchildren Jebediah barely knew. Somewhere up there was home, if he was brave enough to claim it. He touched the letter in his pocket, felt its weight next to his grandfather's compass that he'd given to Thomas. 2 pieces of paper, 2 messages across time. One saying, true north ain't always north. The other saying, come home. Maybe they were the same message, really. Maybe finding your way meant admitting you'd been lost. Maybe coming home meant being brave enough to believe you belonged there. Tomorrow they'd reach the ranch. Tomorrow he'd find out. They crested the final hill just before sunset, and there it was, Thomas's ranch spread out in the valley below. The house, the barn, the corrals with horses moving lazily in the evening light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Jebediah could see figures moving near the house. His family, waiting. His throat went tight. You ready? Thomas asked, and there was understanding in his voice. He knew this moment mattered, knew it carried weight beyond words. As I'll ever be, Jebediah said. They descended the hills slowly. As they got closer, Jebediah could make out details: Emma standing on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she watched them approach. 2 children beside her, the boy tall for 9, the girl small and energetic even from a distance. This was real. This was happening. Emma came down off the porch as they pulled into the yard. She was maybe 35, with brown hair pulled back and a face that showed both kindness and strength. She went to Thomas first, kissed him, then turned to Jebediah as he climbed down from the wagon. Jebediah Vance, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "It's about time you came home." Before he could respond, she hugged him, a real hug, not tentative or polite, but genuine and warm. It surprised him so much that for a moment he just stood there, then his arms came up and he hugged her back. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for writing that letter, for wanting me here." "Thank me by staying," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Your family, that means something in this house." Then Jacob was there, no longer the 6-year-old Jebediah remembered, but a lanky boy with intelligent eyes and Thomas's serious expression. He hung back slightly, uncertain, and Jebediah realized the child probably didn't remember him clearly. "Jacob," Jebediah said, kneeling down to be at eye level. "Last time I saw you, you were catching sunfish in the creek. You remember that?" The boy's face lit up with recognition. "You taught me how to bait the hook. Mom said you had the best fishing stories. I've got more stories if you want to hear them, and if that creek still got fish, maybe we could go again sometime." "Really?" Jacob's reserve broke completely. "I still have the rod, the one you said was mine. I kept it." "You kept it?" Jebediah felt his eyes sting again. "For 3 years. Mom said you'd come back for it someday. That fisherman always come back." Emma touched Jebediah's shoulder gently. "It's in the barn. He oils it every few months, keeps it ready, just in case." The little girl Sarah had been hiding behind her mother's skirts, but now she peeked out, curious. "Are you the grandpa?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "I am," Jebediah said. "And you must be Sarah, named after someone very special." "Grandma," the girl said solemnly. "I never met her, but Daddy says I'm brave like her." "I bet you are." Jebediah pulled a small package from his coat pocket, one of the gifts he'd bought in Tucson. "I brought you something. It's a doll. She's got a red dress and yellow hair." Sarah took the package with wide eyes, unwrapped it carefully, and gasped when she saw the porcelain doll inside. "She's beautiful. Just like you," Jebediah said, and meant it. That evening they gathered around the dinner table, all of them together for the first time in 3 years. Emma had cooked a feast: roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables from her garden, fresh bread that filled the house with its smell. They passed dishes and told stories, and laughed in the easy way families do when they're whole. Jacob asked about the desert, about prospecting, about how Jebediah had survived. Jebediah told him, carefully edited for a 9-year-old's ears, about the map, the cactus, the treasure hidden inside. The boy's eyes went wide with wonder, and Thomas added details that made it feel more real, more possible. After dinner, while Emma put Sarah to bed, Jacob took Jebediah to the barn to see the fishing rod. It hung on the wall near the tack room, exactly where Jebediah remembered hanging it 4 years ago. The bamboo was still smooth and oiled, the line fresh, the hook sharp. The boy had taken care of it like it was precious. "I knew you'd come back," Jacob said simply. "Mom and Dad fought about it sometimes. Dad said maybe you wouldn't. But Mom always said fishermen come back. She said you left your rod here on purpose, so you'd have to come back for it." Jebediah lifted the rod off its hooks, felt its familiar weight, the balance of it. "Your mum's a smart woman, smarter than your dad and me put together. Are you staying this time?" The question was direct and honest, the way children's questions always are. Jebediah could have deflected, could have said, "We'll see," or "for a while," but Jacob deserved better than that. "I'm staying," Jebediah said. "If your family will have me. I've got my own place in the bunkhouse, so I won't be underfoot. But yes, I'm staying. For good this time." Jacob hugged him then, fierce and sudden, and completely unself-conscious. Jebediah held the boy and the fishing rod and felt something settle in his chest, some wandering part of himself finally coming to rest. Later, standing on the porch with Thomas while Emma got the children settled, Jebediah looked out at the ranch. The corrals, the barn, the fields stretching toward the mountains. This was real. This was solid. This was worth more than any gold he'd found in the desert. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for coming back, for saving the ranch, for all of it." "Thank you for letting me," Jebediah replied. for forgiving a stubborn old man who didn't know what he had until he almost lost it. They stood in silence, father and son, watching the stars come out over the Arizona mountains. Inside the house, Emma was singing to Sarah, her voice soft and melodic. Jacob was probably in bed with a book, reading by lamplight. Normal life. Family life. The kind Jebediah had walked away from and somehow, miraculously, been allowed to return to. He thought about the cactus standing wounded in the desert, about Clementine dying in the shade of a Palo Verde tree, about his grandfather's compass passing to a new generation. He thought about all the wrong turns that had led him to exactly the right place. True north ain't always north, but eventually, if you kept walking, kept trying, kept your heart open, eventually you found your way home. And home, it turned out, was worth every hard mile it took to get there. 6 months passed. Jebediah settled into life on the ranch with an ease that surprised everyone, including himself. He took the bunkhouse as his own, fixed it up with furniture bought in Flagstaff, made it comfortable. But he rarely slept there. Most nights found him on the porch, or helping with late chores, or reading to Sarah before bed. He existed in that space between independent and integrated, part of the family but not a burden on it. The remaining gold from the Wells Fargo account got put to good use. They expanded the ranch, bought more cattle, hired 2 hands to help with the work, built a new well that meant water even in drought years. Thomas protested at first, but Jebediah reminded him that the gold was family money now, meant to secure all their futures. Emma had been right about everything. She usually was. Jebediah fit into their lives like he'd never left, or like he was always meant to be there and had just taken a long detour to figure it out. He and Thomas worked side by side. Their old conflicts faded to occasional stubbornness about minor things, the best way to mend a fence, whether to plant alfalfa or corn in the south field. Normal father-son disagreements, the kind that ended with compromise instead of silence. Jacob became his shadow. The boy wanted to know everything about prospecting, about the old days, about his great-grandfather Jacob and the compass that now sat on the boy's shelf. They went fishing every Saturday, using the rod Jacob had kept oiled and ready. They caught sunfish and talked about life, and Jebediah discovered that being a grandfather was different from being a father. Easier in some ways. The stakes felt lower, the moments more precious, because he understood how quickly they passed. Sarah warmed to him gradually, then completely. She'd climb into his lap while he sat on the porch, make him tell stories about the desert, demand to see the gold coins he kept in a small box in his room. He'd let her hold one, help her feel its weight, tell her about the cactus that had hidden it for 20 years. Like treasure in a fairy tale, she'd say, eyes wide. Exactly like that, he'd agree. Except real. One evening in early fall, with the first cool air coming down from the mountains, Jebediah sat at the small desk in his bunkhouse and began writing. Not to Thomas this time. They saw each other every day, talked regularly, had rebuilt their relationship through presence instead of words. This letter was for Jacob, for some time in the future when the boy was old enough to understand its full meaning. He wrote carefully, thinking through each word. Dear Jacob, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that life rarely goes the way we plan. That's not a bad thing. Sometimes the detours teach us more than the straight paths ever could. I'm writing this 6 months after coming home to your father's ranch. Home. That word means more to me now than it did when I left 3 years ago. Back then, I thought home was just a place, walls and a roof and familiar ground. I was wrong. Home is people. Home is family. Home is knowing you belong somewhere, not because you're useful, but because you're loved. I want to tell you about a compass. Your great-great-grandfather, Jacob, the man you're named after, carried it through the California gold rush. He scratched an inscription inside. True north ain't always north. I carried that compass for 3 years in the desert, never fully understanding what it meant. Now I do. Sometimes the direction that makes sense, the path everyone tells you is right, isn't the path you need to take. Sometimes you have to get lost to find your way. I left your father's ranch thinking I was doing the right thing, giving everyone space, proving I could still matter, chasing dreams that seemed important. I was wrong about almost all of it. But that wrong path led me to a cactus in the Sonoran Desert, and that cactus saved my life and led me back to family. True north isn't always north. Sometimes it's exactly the opposite direction from where you think you should go. I nearly died finding the treasure I'm going to tell you about now. Your father will have told you some version of this story, but I want you to hear it from me, in my own words, so you understand what it meant. There was gold hidden inside a saguaro cactus, 473 $20 gold pieces lost for 20 years. I found them when I was dying of thirst, when I cut into that cactus hoping for water. The gold alone would have been enough to change our lives, but what saved me was the water that had condensed around the metal, clean, cool water that gave me the strength to walk back to civilization. The treasure came with the means to survive long enough to use it. That's a metaphor worth remembering. Sometimes salvation and fortune arrive together, each making the other possible. I used that gold to pay off your father's ranch loan, to help secure your future and your sister's future, to come home not as a burden, but as someone who could contribute. But the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was being allowed back into this family. It was fishing with you on Saturdays. It was seeing your grandmother's fierce spirit in your little sister. It was working beside your father and rebuilding what pride had broken. This compass is yours now. Your father gave it to me, and I'm giving it to you. Pass it on to your children someday, and tell them about the prospectors and dreamers who carried it before. Tell them that getting lost is sometimes necessary. Tell them that treasure comes in unexpected forms. Tell them that family is worth more than gold. Most importantly, tell them that it's never too late to come home, never too late to admit you were wrong, never too late to choose people over pride. I wasted 3 years learning that lesson. Don't waste yours. I love you, Jacob. I'm proud of the man you're becoming, and I'm grateful every day that I found my way back in time to know you. Your grandfather, Jebediah Vance. P.S. The fishing rod is yours too. Keep it oiled. You never know when you'll need it. Jebediah folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. He'd give it to Thomas to hold, with instructions to pass it to Jacob when the boy turned 18. By then, Jacob would understand. By then, the simple truths in the letter would mean something deeper. Outside his window, the ranch was settling into evening. He could hear Emma calling the children for dinner, Thomas's voice answering from the barn, the comfortable sounds of family life continuing its eternal rhythm. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything gold, the same color as the coins that had brought him here, the same color as second chances and new beginnings. Jebediah stood, tucked the letter into his desk drawer, and walked toward the house. Toward dinner and family, and all the small moments that made up a life worth living. He'd found his treasure in the desert. He'd found his fortune in a cactus. But he'd found his home in the people waiting at that dinner table, and that was worth more than all the gold the Arizona Territory had ever yielded. True north ain't always north, but if you kept walking, kept trying, kept your heart open to possibility, eventually, you found exactly where you needed to be. And Jebediah Vance was finally, gratefully, home.